when 17-year-old Abigail Hayes was dragged into a Cherokee camp as a prize for ruthless traders. She expected brutality, bondage, and a slow death in the wilderness. But the warrior who claimed her would challenge everything she believed about savagery, honor, and what it truly meant to be free. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Cherokee encampment as Abigail Hayes stumbled through the entrance, her wrists bound with coarse rope that had already rubbed her skin raw. During the 3-day journey from Fort Bridger, her captors, a band of white traders who dealt in human misery as easily as they traded whiskey and gunpowder, shoved her forward with the casual cruelty of men who had long since forgotten that their cargo had once been someone's daughter. Fresh, and from a settler family outside Cheyenne, announced Marcus Dalton, the lead trader whose yellowed teeth and whiskey-soaked breath had haunted Abby's nightmares since the moment he'd torn her from her family's burning cabin. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Strong too. Put up quite a fight when we took her. Abby kept her chin raised despite the terror clawing at her chest, her green eyes scanning the faces of the Cherokee warriors who had gathered to witness this obscene transaction. She'd heard stories all her life about Indian savages who tortured white captives, who kept scalps as trophies and delighted in prolonged suffering. Now, staring into the weathered faces of these men, she expected to see that cruelty reflected back at her. Instead, she saw something that confused her more than violence would have. The Cherokee warriors watched her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to what almost looked like pity. Their leader, an older man with silver streaking his long black hair and deep lines carved around intelligent dark eyes, studied her with the intensity of someone evaluating not prey, but a problem that required careful consideration. "She is not for sale to you, Dalton," the chief said in English that carried only the slightest accent, his voice carrying the quiet authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed without question. "We do not trade in human flesh like you do." Dalton's face twisted into an ugly sneer, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip in a gesture that was meant to be threatening but looked merely pathetic against the dozen Cherokee warriors who had silently shifted positions to surround the traders. "Now hold on there, Chief Adahy. We had us a deal, whiskey and rifles in exchange for taking this girl off your hands. You said you needed to, send a message to the white settlers about respecting Cherokee land. I said we would consider your proposal," Chief Adahy replied, his tone never changing from that calm, measured cadence that somehow made Dalton's bluster seem even more foolish. "I have considered it. The answer is no. We are not like you." Abby felt a flicker of something that might have been hope, but it died quickly as she saw the calculation in Dalton's eyes. These men had not dragged her 300 miles through hostile territory just to be turned away empty-handed. They would find another way to make their profit from her suffering. "Well now, that's a shame," Dalton said, his voice taking on a deceptively casual tone that Abby had learned to fear. "Because you see, Chief, we've got ourselves a little problem. This girl here, she's seen things during our journey, things that certain folks back at the fort might find mighty interesting, things about Cherokee movements, hunting parties maybe, even plans about resistance to the removal orders. The threat hung in the morning air like smoke from a dying fire, and Abby saw several of the younger Cherokee warriors tense at the implications. She understood now why Dalton was so confident. He wasn't just selling her as a captive, he was selling her as a potential source of intelligence that could be used against these people. "So here's what I'm thinking," Dalton continued, emboldened by the reaction his words had provoked. "Maybe you don't want to trade whiskey for the girl, but maybe you might be interested in trading something else, like ensuring her permanent silence about what she's seen and heard." Chief Adahy's expression didn't change, but Abby caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested Dalton had finally managed to hit a nerve. The chief was too intelligent not to understand the implications. Whether they bought her or not, her existence represented a threat to his people's safety. "You would threaten an innocent girl to force our hand in this matter?" Chief Adahi asked, his voice still calm, but carrying an undertone of steel that made even Dalton shift uncomfortably. "I ain't threatening nobody," Dalton replied with false innocence. "I'm just pointing out facts. Girls seen things, heard things. Can't unsee them or unhear them, can she? Unless, of course, she was to meet with some kind of accident, which would be a shame, seeing as how she's such a pretty little thing." That was when one of the Cherokee warriors stepped forward, and Abby felt her breath catch in her throat. He was younger than the chief, but older than the eager-faced boys who clustered around the edges of the gathering, perhaps 25 or 26, with the kind of presence that drew attention without demanding it. Tall and lean, with the muscular build of someone who lived by physical skill and endurance, he moved with a fluid grace that reminded Abby of the mountain cats she had sometimes glimpsed near her family's cabin. But it was his face that held her attention. Where she had expected to see the savage cruelty of her nightmares, she instead found intelligent dark eyes that seemed to miss nothing, a strong jaw that spoke of determination rather than brutality, and an expression of such controlled anger that it was somehow more intimidating than any display of rage would have been. This was not the face of a mindless savage, but of a man who was capable of violence, but chose when and how to employ it. "I will take her," he said in English that was more precise than Dalton's, his voice carrying a quiet certainty that suggested the matter was already decided. "Name your price." Chief Adahi turned to study the younger warrior, and Abby caught something that looked like surprise flickering across his weathered features. "Chayton, you do not need to—" "I will take her," Chayton repeated, his gaze never wavering from Dalton's face. "She will be under my protection. No harm will come to her while she remains in our territory." Dalton's eyes lit up with greedy satisfaction, and Abby felt her stomach drop as she realized that whatever reprieve Chief Adahi might have offered was disappearing. "Now that's more like it. I knew you Cherokee were reasonable folks. What you offering?" "2 horses," Chayton said without hesitation, "both strong, both trained for long travel, and a promise that you will never return to Cherokee land with such an offer again." The price was generous. Abby knew enough about frontier economics to understand that 2 good horses represented significant wealth, but it was the second part of Chayton's offer that made Dalton hesitate. Being banned from Cherokee territory would limit the trader's movements and opportunities considerably. "Make it 3 horses, and we got ourselves a deal," Dalton countered, his merchant instincts overriding any other considerations. Chayton was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes studying Abby's face with an intensity that made her want to look away, but somehow prevented her from doing so. She had the strange feeling that he was seeing not just her current desperate situation, but something deeper. Perhaps the person she had been before terror and trauma had reduced her to this trembling, bound creature. 3 horses, he agreed, finally. "And supplies for your journey back to the fort. But if I ever see you in Cherokee territory again, horses will be the least of your concerns." The threat was delivered in the same calm, measured tone he had used for everything else. But there was something in his eyes that made Dalton nod quickly and extend his hand to seal the bargain. The trader was clearly eager to complete the transaction and be gone before anyone could reconsider the terms. As the 2 men shook hands, Abby felt the last of her hope crumble into dust. She had been sold again. This time to a Cherokee warrior whose motivations she couldn't begin to understand, whose intentions toward her were completely unknown, and whose people had every reason to hate everything she represented. The stories she had heard about Indian captives flashed through her mind: torture, slavery, ritual murder, fates worse than death. Chayton approached her slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, as if he were approaching a wounded animal that might bolt or attack if startled. When he reached for the ropes binding her wrists, Abby instinctively flinched away, her body remembering 3 days of rough handling and casual violence. "I will not hurt you," he said quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. The words were spoken with such simple sincerity that they somehow managed to penetrate the wall of terror that had surrounded her thoughts since her capture. His hands, when they touched the rope, were gentle but sure, working at the knots with practiced efficiency. Abby found herself studying his fingers as he worked, long and strong, marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived out. "What happens now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now you come with me," Chayton replied. "You will be given food, clean water, a place to rest. Tomorrow we will speak of what comes after." Behind them, Dalton was already leading, his promised horses away from the camp, eager to be gone before anyone could change their mind about the bargain. He didn't look back at Abby, didn't offer any farewell or acknowledgement that she had ever been anything more than cargo to be delivered. As Abby watched her captors disappear into the morning haze, she realized that whatever came next, she was now truly alone among people who had every reason to see her as an enemy. But when she looked up at Chayton, she saw something in his eyes that suggested her assumptions about what that meant might be as wrong as everything else she had believed about this situation. "Come," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "My mother will want to see that you are properly cared for." And as Abby fell into step beside him, her legs unsteady after days of being bound and roughly transported, she caught something in his tone that made her wonder if being sold to a Cherokee warrior might not be the death sentence she had expected. The camp around them was larger than she had initially realized, with dozens of lodges arranged in careful patterns that spoke of organization and permanence rather than the temporary raiding party she had imagined. Women tended fires and worked on various tasks. Children played games that seemed universal across cultures, and men engaged in activities that ranged from weapon maintenance to what looked like earnest political discussions. It looked, she realized with surprise, like a community, like a home. As they walked deeper into the camp, Abby became aware that they were being watched, but not with the hostile curiosity she had expected. The Cherokee people they passed looked at her, with expressions that ranged from mild interest to something that almost seemed like sympathy. A few of the women nodded respectfully to Chayton and offered what sounded like words of greeting or advice. "They are telling me to make sure you are fed," Chayton explained, apparently noticing her confusion. "My people believe that hospitality to those in need is a sacred duty, regardless of the circumstances that brought them to us." The simple kindness in his words, coming after days of being treated as less than human, nearly brought tears to Abby's eyes. She blinked them back, determined not to show weakness, but she suspected that Chayton had noticed anyway. They stopped before a lodge that was larger than most of the others, its hide covering decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories Abby couldn't begin to interpret. Chayton called out something in Cherokee, and a voice from within responded with what sounded like an invitation. "My mother," Chayton explained. "She will provide for your immediate needs while we determine what is to be done about your situation." The woman who emerged from the lodge was perhaps 50 years old, with graying hair braided with beads and a face that carried the same intelligent alertness Abby had noticed in her son. She looked Abby up and down, with the practiced eye of someone accustomed to evaluating medical conditions, then spoke rapidly to Chayton in Cherokee. "She says you need food, rest, and clean clothing," Chayton translated. "She also says that anyone who would sell a young woman like livestock deserves to have their horses stolen and their hair set on fire, but that is between her and the spirits." Despite everything, Abby felt a small smile tug at the corners of her mouth. Chaitan's mother, whose name she learned was Ayana, took charge of Abby's immediate care with the brisk efficiency of someone who would not tolerate any arguments about what needed to be done. Within minutes, Abby found herself seated near a warm fire with a bowl of something that smelled better than anything she had eaten in weeks, and a cup of water that was mercifully clean and cool. "Eat slowly," Chaitan advised, settling down across the fire from her. "Your stomach will need time to adjust after the journey you have endured." As Abby ate, she became aware that Chaitan was watching her with the same careful attention he had shown earlier, but now she began to understand that it was not the attention of a predator evaluating prey. It was the attention of someone trying to solve a problem, someone trying to figure out how to help. The realization was so unexpected, so contrary to everything she had been taught to believe about Indian captivity, that it took her several minutes to accept what her own observations were telling her. This Cherokee warrior, who had just traded 3 valuable horses for her, was not planning to torture her, enslave her, or use her for his own gratification. He was trying to figure out how to take care of her. And that knowledge, more than anything else that had happened since her capture, finally allowed Abigail Hayes to believe that she might actually survive whatever came next. The Cherokee Lodge was nothing like the primitive shelter Abby had imagined during her terrified journey to the camp. Constructed with careful engineering that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge, the structure stayed remarkably warm, despite the cool mountain air outside, and the interior was arranged with a logic that maximized both comfort and efficiency. Ayana had insisted that Abby sleep on a bed of soft furs near the central fire, a position that in any white household would have been reserved for honored guests rather than captives. The older woman had also provided her with clean clothing, a simple dress made of soft deerskin that fit surprisingly well and felt like luxury after days in her torn and filthy settler's dress. But it was the small gestures that truly bewildered Abby. The way Ayana had gently examined her rope burns and applied a healing salve that immediately soothed the pain. The way she had heated water for Abby to wash herself properly for the first time since her capture. The way she had braided Abby's clean hair with the same care she might show to her own daughter, humming softly while she worked. None of it matched anything Abby had been taught to expect from Indian captors. She woke at dawn to the sound of voices speaking in low, urgent Cherokee outside the lodge. Through the hide walls, she could make out Chaitan's distinctive tone, engaged in what sounded like an intense discussion with several other men. Though she couldn't understand the words, the rhythm and cadence suggested argument, persuasion, and the kind of political maneuvering that happened in any community faced with a difficult decision. Ayana noticed her listening and approached with a wooden bowl of something that smelled wonderfully of corn and meat. "They argue about you," she said in careful English, settling down beside Abby with her own breakfast. "Some think it was foolish for my son to trade horses for a white girl when winter approaches and we may need to move again soon." Abby felt her stomach clench with renewed fear, but Ayana continued in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested she was discussing the weather rather than Abby's potential fate. "Others say that Chaitan showed wisdom by preventing the traders from selling you to someone who would use you badly. They say that honor demands we care for those who have been wronged, regardless of the color of their skin. What do you think?" Abby asked quietly. Ayana studied her with dark eyes that seemed to see far more than they revealed. "I think my son has always been drawn to lost things that need protection. When he was a boy, he brought home injured animals, birds with broken wings, runts that would not survive without help. Sometimes this kindness served him well, sometimes it brought trouble." The implication was clear, and Abby felt heat rise in her cheeks as she realized she had been classified as another. of Chaitan's charity cases, a wounded creature that he felt compelled to rescue. The knowledge stung, though she couldn't quite understand why it should matter what motivated his kindness. "Am I trouble?" she asked. "That remains to be seen," Ayana replied, with what might have been the ghost of a smile. "But I have learned that trouble often comes disguised as necessity, and necessity often comes disguised as trouble. The spirits have their own purposes, which are not always clear to us until much later." Before Abby could ask what that meant, the lodge flap opened, and Chaitan entered, ducking slightly to clear the entrance. In the morning light, she could see him more clearly than she had during yesterday's transaction, and she was struck again by how different he was from the savage of her imagination. "The council wishes to speak with you," he said without preamble, his tone neutral but not unkind. "They have questions about what you saw and heard during your journey here." Abby's heart began to race as she remembered Dalton's threats about the intelligence value of what she had witnessed. "What kind of questions?" "Questions that will help them determine whether your presence here represents a danger to our people," Chaitan replied honestly, "and questions that will help them decide what is to be done with you now that you are here." The fear must have shown on her face because his expression softened slightly. "You will not be harmed, regardless of what you tell them. But they need to understand what you know and what you might reveal if you were to return to the white settlements." Abby nodded, though her throat felt tight with anxiety. She had indeed seen and heard things during the forced march to the Cherokee camp, conversations between Dalton and his men about Indian movements, observations about the location and defenses of the camp, details about the number of warriors and their apparent readiness for conflict. Information that could be valuable to military commanders or settlers planning attacks. "Will you be there?" she asked. "If you wish it," Chaitan replied. "Though it might be better if you spoke for yourself. The council will respect your courage more than my protection." 20 minutes later, Abby found herself standing in the center of a circle formed by a dozen Cherokee men who represented the camp's leadership. Chief Adai sat directly across from her, his weathered face impassive as he studied her with the same careful attention she had noticed yesterday. To his right and left sat men who appeared to range in age from their 30s to their 60s, all of them watching her with expressions that revealed nothing of their thoughts. Chaitan stood behind her and slightly to her left, close enough that she could sense his presence without him dominating the interaction. His positioning, she realized, was carefully calculated to indicate support, without suggesting that she couldn't speak for herself. "Abigail Hayes," Chief Adahi began, his English formal and precise. "We would hear from you about the circumstances of your capture and the journey that brought you to our territory." Abby took a deep breath and began to speak, telling them about the attack on her family's cabin, about Dalton's men killing her father and taking her as valuable cargo, about the 3-day journey during which she had been treated as less than human. She described the traders' casual discussions of Cherokee movements and their plans to sell information along with captives. The council listened in silence, their faces revealing nothing, though she noticed that several of them exchanged glances when she described Dalton's intelligence-gathering activities. When she finished, Chief Adahi leaned forward slightly. "What did these traders tell you about Cherokee plans for resistance to the removal orders?" he asked. "Nothing directly," Abby replied honestly, "but they spoke among themselves about trying to provoke incidents that would justify military action against your people. They seemed to think that if they could create enough conflict, it would make the forced removal easier to accomplish." This time, the reaction from the council was more visible. Several men spoke quietly to each other in Cherokee, their tones suggesting anger and concern. Chief Adahi raised a hand for silence before continuing. "And what would you do with this knowledge if you were returned to the white settlements?" he asked. The question hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Abby realized that her answer would likely determine her fate. She could lie, promise to say nothing, swear oaths of secrecy that they would have no reason to believe. Or she could tell the truth and accept whatever consequences followed. "I would warn people about men like Dalton," she said finally. "I would tell them that not all traders can be trusted, that some of them profit from creating conflict rather than preventing it. But I would not betray information that could be used to harm your people." "Why?" asked one of the younger council members, his voice carrying skepticism. "Why would you protect the interests of Cherokee over the interests of your own people?" Abby thought about her father, dead because he had trusted the wrong men. She thought about her mother, lost to fever the previous winter while Abby was away at school. She thought about the cabin that had been her home, now nothing but ashes because greedy men saw profit in chaos. "Because your people aren't my enemies," she said quietly. "The men who killed my father and burned my home, who treated me like livestock to be sold, they are my enemies. The people who showed me kindness when they had no reason to do so, who fed me and gave me clean clothes and a safe place to sleep, why would I betray them?" The council fell silent again, and Abby could feel the weight of their evaluation. She had spoken the truth as she saw it, but she had no way of knowing whether they would believe her or whether her honesty would be enough to save her. Chief Adahy spoke briefly in Cherokee to the other council members, and several conversations broke out simultaneously. The discussion continued for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, with various men offering what sounded like arguments for different courses of action. Finally, the chief raised his hand again, and the talking stopped. "We have decided," he announced, looking directly at Abby. "You will remain here as our guest for the winter months. When spring comes and travel becomes safer, we will escort you to a settlement where you can make your own choices about your future. Until then, you will be under the protection of this camp and subject to our laws and customs." Relief flooded through Abby so suddenly that her knees nearly buckled. Not freedom exactly, but not death either. A reprieve that might last long enough for her to figure out what came next. "However," Chief Adahy continued, "you must understand that this protection comes with responsibilities. You will contribute to the welfare of the community according to your abilities. You will respect our ways and our people, and you will give your word that you will not attempt to leave the camp without permission or try to send messages to the outside world." "I understand," Abby said, though she wasn't entirely sure she did. "And I give my word." "Then it is settled," the chief declared. "Chayton, you brought her here, so the responsibility for her integration into our community will rest with you and your family. See that she learns what she needs to know to be useful and to avoid giving offense." As the council dispersed, Abby found herself alone with Chayton, who had remained silent throughout the entire proceeding. Now he looked at her with an expression that was difficult to read. "Are you disappointed?" he asked finally. "Disappointed?" Abby was confused by the question. "Why would I be disappointed? They're letting me live. They are making you a prisoner," Chayton pointed out. "You cannot leave, cannot contact your own people, cannot make your own choices about your future. For someone who has already been captive, this might feel like simply changing one cage for another." Abby considered this. It was true that her situation had improved only relatively. She was still not free to go where she pleased or live as she chose. But somehow the restrictions imposed by the Cherokee Council felt fundamentally different from the bondage she had experienced with Dalton. "It doesn't feel like a cage," she said slowly, trying to put her thoughts into words. "It feels like being given time to heal, time to figure out who I am now that everything I used to be is gone." Chayton nodded as if her answer satisfied him in some way. "Good. Then we can begin." "Begin what?" "Teaching you how to be Cherokee," he replied with what might have been a small smile. If you are going to live among us for the winter, you will need to understand our ways well enough to avoid accidentally insulting someone or violating taboos that could cause problems. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Over the following days, Abby discovered that learning to be Cherokee involved far more than she had anticipated. It wasn't just a matter of learning new customs or different ways of doing familiar tasks. It was like learning to see the world through completely different eyes. Ayana taught her how to prepare traditional foods, but also explained the spiritual significance of various ingredients and the proper way to thank the spirits of the plants and animals that gave their lives to sustain the community. The lessons weren't just practical. They were windows into a way of understanding the relationship between humans and the natural world that was utterly foreign to Abby's settler upbringing. Chayton taught her basic Cherokee words and phrases, but also explained the cultural concepts behind the language. Cherokee thinking, she learned, was structured differently from English thinking, with different assumptions about time, causality, and the nature of relationships between people and things. In English, he explained one afternoon as they sat beside the stream that provided the camp's water supply, "You say, I have a sister." The distinction fascinated Abby, who had never thought about how language might shape thought, but it also made her realize how much she had to unlearn, as well as learn if she was going to truly understand Cherokee culture, rather than simply mimicking its surface forms. Perhaps most challenging was learning to navigate the complex social relationships that governed camp life. Cherokee society, she discovered, was structured around clan affiliations, age hierarchies, and gender roles that were both more rigid and more flexible than what she was accustomed to. Women held positions of significant authority in areas that white society would have reserved for men, but there were also taboos and expectations that seemed arbitrary to her settler sensibilities. "Why can't I help with preparing the weapons?" she asked Chayton, after being gently but firmly redirected away from a group of men working on arrowheads. "Because weapons are tools for taking life, and women are the givers of life," he explained patiently. "It would be like asking a man to assist with childbirth, not forbidden exactly, but contrary to the natural order of things." "But women hunt," Abby pointed out, having observed several Cherokee women returning from successful hunting expeditions. "Women hunt for food, to sustain life. Men make weapons for war, to defend against those who would destroy life. The activities may look similar to you, but they serve different purposes and carry different spiritual significance." Gradually, Abby began to understand that Cherokee culture was built around a complex philosophy that saw all of existence as interconnected and interdependent. Every action had spiritual as well as practical consequences. Every relationship carried obligations as well as benefits. And every individual was expected to contribute to the welfare of the whole community in ways appropriate to their gifts and circumstances. It was, she realized, a way of living that was both more demanding and more nurturing than the individualistic frontier culture she had grown up with. What surprised her most was how quickly she began to adapt to this new way of thinking. The Cherokee emphasis on community responsibility and mutual support felt natural to her in ways that the competitive individualism of settler culture never had. She found herself looking forward to the communal meals where everyone contributed what they could and everyone was fed according to their needs. She enjoyed the evening storytelling sessions where the accumulated wisdom of the tribe was passed down through narrative rather than formal instruction. Most of all, she found herself drawn to the Cherokee understanding of time as cyclical rather than linear, of life as part of an ongoing pattern rather than a series of discrete events. After months of feeling like her life had been shattered beyond repair, the Cherokee worldview offered her a way of seeing her current circumstances as part of a larger story that was still unfolding. "You are learning quickly," Ayana observed. One evening as they worked together, preparing hides for winter clothing. Some people never understand that becoming Cherokee is not about changing who you are, but about discovering who you have always been underneath the things other people taught you to believe about yourself. Abby looked up from the hide she was scraping, surprised by the insight. "Is that what's happening to me?" "What do you think?" Ayana replied, in the indirect way that Abby was learning was typical of Cherokee teaching methods. As October gave way to November and the mountain air grew crisp with the promise of winter, Abby found herself settling into rhythms of daily life that felt increasingly natural. She woke before dawn to help tend the fires, spent her mornings learning domestic skills from Ayana and other women, devoted her afternoons to language lessons with Chaitin, and ended her days contributing to whatever communal tasks needed extra hands. But it was the small, unguarded moments that revealed how much her situation had changed. The way Chaitin smiled when she successfully pronounced a difficult Cherokee phrase. The way Ayana hummed while they worked together, as if Abby's presence brought her contentment rather than burden. The way other members of the camp began to nod to her in greeting, to include her in conversations, to treat her like a person rather than an obligation. 3 months after being dragged into the Cherokee camp as a terrified captive, Abigail, Hayes realized that she was beginning to feel like she belonged somewhere, and that recognition was more frightening than anything Dalton had threatened, because it meant she had something to lose again. Winter arrived early in the Cherokee mountains, bringing with it a crystalline silence that seemed to transform the entire world into something carved from ice and starlight. The camp had shifted its rhythms to match the season. Longer nights gathered around fires, sharing stories that stretched back generations. Days devoted to crafts and repairs that would see the community through until spring, and a deepening sense of interdependence that made every person's contribution vital to collective survival. Abby had expected the cold months to feel like imprisonment, trapped in close quarters with people who were still essentially strangers despite their kindness. Instead, she found herself experiencing something she had never known in her previous life, the security of being part of something larger than herself, something that would endure regardless of what happened to any individual member. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but through 1,000 small moments that accumulated like snow on mountain peaks. There was the morning she woke to find that someone had replenished the fire beside her sleeping place during the night, ensuring she stayed warm without her having to ask. There was the afternoon when she successfully completed her first pair of moccasins, and the older women of the camp examined her work with the same serious attention they would give to evaluating the craftsmanship of their own daughters. There was the evening when she told her first story in halting Cherokee, recounting a folktale from her childhood, and realized halfway through that she was no longer translating from English in her head, but thinking directly in the rhythms and concepts of her adopted language. But perhaps most significantly, there were the daily interactions with Chaitin that had evolved from formal instruction into something that felt increasingly like genuine friendship. "Your pronunciation is improving," he told her one December morning as they walked through the snow-covered forest, checking traps that provided supplemental protein for the camp's winter diet. "But you're still thinking like someone who learned Cherokee as a second language rather than someone who dreams in it." "How can you tell?" Abby asked, adjusting her grip on the snowshoes that had taken her weeks to master. "Because you construct sentences the way you would in English, then translate the words. A person who truly thinks in Cherokee would arrange the ideas differently, would emphasize different relationships between concepts, He stopped beside a deadfall that had been carefully constructed to funnel small game toward a hidden snare. The trap was empty, but there were fresh tracks in the snow that suggested recent animal activity. "Show me what you mean," Abby said, crouching down to examine the tracks while he reset the mechanism. Chayton considered for a moment, then pointed to a pair of ravens perched in a nearby pine tree. "In English, you would say, 'I see 2 ravens in that tree.' The focus is on you as the observer, with the ravens as objects that you are looking at. In Cherokee, we might say something closer to, 2 ravens are revealing themselves to us from their place in the pine." The focus is on the relationship, on what is being shared between us and them. Abby studied the birds, trying to shift her mental perspective in the way he was describing. "So instead of thinking about seeing them, I should think about receiving what they're offering." Exactly. The difference between taking and receiving, between observing and participating, between being separate from the world and being part of it. As they continued their circuit of the traps, Abby found, "My grandfather taught me that the forest is always speaking," he explained when she asked about his seemingly intuitive knowledge of their surroundings. "Most people have forgotten how to listen, so they miss the conversations happening around them all the time." "What is it saying now?" Abby asked, only half joking. Chayton stopped walking and stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something beyond the range of her perception. When he finally moved again, it was to change their direction slightly, leading them toward what looked like an unremarkable section of forest. "It's saying that the storm coming tomorrow will be worse than expected," he said matter-of-factly, "and that there are strangers moving through the valley to the east, but they're still more than a day's travel from here." Abby looked around, seeing only snow-laden trees and the same mountain landscape they had been traversing all morning. "And how can you possibly know that from looking at trees and listening to birds? The same way you know that someone is angry before they start shouting, or that a storm is coming before you see the clouds. You read the signs that most people ignore because they're focused on more obvious things." As if to prove his point, the wind suddenly shifted, bringing with it a scent that made Chayton tense with alert attention. Abby caught it too, wood smoke but not from their camp, and carrying the wrong mixture of smells to be from a Cherokee fire. "We need to go back," Chayton said quietly, his whole demeanor changing from teacher to protector in an instant. Now, they covered the return journey in half the time it had taken them to reach the outer traps, Chayton setting a pace that pushed Abby to the limits of her endurance, but never quite beyond them. By the time they reached the camp's perimeter, she was exhausted and confused, but she could see that the same alertness that had seized Chayton was now affecting the entire community. Warriors were checking weapons and discussing defensive positions in low, urgent voices. Women were securing supplies and making preparations that suggested they might need to evacuate quickly. Children were being quietly gathered into the central area where they could be watched more easily. "Chief." Dahi emerged from his lodge as they approached, his weathered face grim with concern. "What did you see?" he asked Chayton without preamble. "Smoke from the eastern valley, wrong composition for Cherokee fires. At least 3 separate sources, probably more. And the forest sounds indicate a large group moving through territory they don't know well." The chief nodded, as if this confirmed information he had received from other sources. "How long do we have?" "If they're trying to track us, they could be here by tomorrow evening. If they know where we are and are planning an attack, they could arrive as early as tomorrow morning." Abby felt ice form in her stomach as she realized what they were discussing. "It's Dalton, isn't it? He's come back." Chief Adahi turned, his attention to her, and she saw in his eyes a mixture of sympathy and calculation that she found more frightening than outright hostility would have been. "What makes you think that?" "Because he knows I'm here. He knows that I've learned things about your camp, your people, your defenses. If he could recapture me and force me to tell him what I've seen—" Abby's voice trailed off as the full implications hit her. "He could sell that information for more than he got for the horses, or use it himself," Chayton added grimly. "Dalton struck me as the kind of man who holds grudges. Being banned from Cherokee territory would have cost him significantly in lost opportunities." Chief Adehi was quiet for a long moment, weighing options that Abby couldn't begin to guess at. When he spoke again, it was with the decisive authority of someone who had made difficult decisions before and understood their consequences. "We will not run from men like this," he declared. "But we will also not allow them to endanger our people unnecessarily. The women and children will be moved to the winter caves in the high country. The warriors will remain here to discourage any thoughts of pursuit." "And what about me?" Abby asked, though she dreaded the answer. "You will go with the women and children," the chief replied. "Your presence here is what draws these men, so your absence may convince them to look elsewhere for easier prey." "No." The word came out of Abby's mouth before she had consciously decided to speak, surprising her as much as anyone else. "I won't run and hide while you risk your lives to protect me. That's not who I want to be." Chayton stared at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Abby, you don't understand what you're saying. If Dalton recaptures you, then I'll deal with that when it happens," she interrupted. "But I won't spend the rest of my life running from men like him, and I won't let other people die fighting battles that are really mine." Chief Adehi studied her with the same careful attention he had shown during her first appearance before the council. "And what do you propose to do instead? You are not a warrior. You have no training in combat. You would be more liability than asset in any fight." Abby felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she forced herself to think clearly despite her emotional response to what felt like dismissal. The chief wasn't wrong. She had no military skills, no experience with violence beyond what she had endured rather than inflicted. But she did have something else. "I know Dalton," she said slowly, working through the idea as she spoke. "I know how he thinks, how he operates, what he wants. Maybe that knowledge could be useful in ways that don't require me to fight anyone." "Explain," Chief Adehi commanded. "Dalton is a businessman first and a violent man second. He uses force when it serves his profit, but he doesn't enjoy it. For its own sake, if there was a way to make pursuing me more expensive than profitable—" Abby paused, trying to organize her thoughts. "What if instead of hiding from him, we made it clear that I'm exactly where he expects to find me, but that taking me would cost him more than leaving me alone?" Chayton shook his head. "You're talking about using yourself as bait. That's not strategy. It's suicide." "Not bait," Abby corrected. "Leverage. Dalton came here because he thinks recapturing me will be profitable, but what if he discovered that I'm not the helpless victim he left here? What if he learned that I've become someone who could cause him significant problems if he tries to take me by force?" Chief Adehi leaned forward slightly, his interest clearly engaged despite his reservations. "What kind of problems?" "I know things about his operation now that I didn't know when he first captured me. I know the names of his associates, the locations of his camps, the details of his trafficking routes, information that certain military authorities would find very valuable, especially if it came from someone who had been inside his organization." "You would threaten to expose him?" Chayton asked. "I would make it clear that my continued well-being is in his best interest," Abby replied. "That harming me or taking me against my will would result in consequences that far outweigh any profit he might gain." The conversation continued for another hour, with various warriors and council members offering opinions about the risks and benefits of Abby's proposal. Some argued that it was too dangerous to trust their security to the untested courage of someone who had been among them for only a few months. Others pointed out that traditional approaches to dealing with men like Dalton had proven ineffective. Finally, Chief Adahi raised his hand for silence. "We will try a modified version of your plan," he told Abby. "You will remain in the camp, but under heavy protection. When Dalton arrives, you will speak with him, but not alone and not without safeguards. If your approach fails to discourage him, we will fall back on more traditional methods of persuasion." That evening, as the camp prepared for what might be its last peaceful night for some time, Abby found herself sitting beside the central fire with Chaitin, both of them staring into flames that seemed to hold answers to questions they hadn't yet learned to ask. "Are you frightened?" he asked quietly. "Terrified," Abby admitted, "but also excited, I think. For the first time since Dalton took me, I feel like I have some control over what happens next." Chaitin nodded slowly. "Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the willingness to act despite fear when action is necessary." "Oh, is that what you think I'm doing? Acting courageously?" "I think you're becoming who you were always meant to be," he replied. "Someone who doesn't let others define her worth or determine her fate." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching sparks rise toward stars that seemed unusually bright in the clear winter air. Finally, Chaitin spoke again, his voice carrying a quality of careful consideration that suggested he was choosing his words with unusual precision. "Abby, there's something I need to tell you before tomorrow brings whatever it's going to bring." She turned to look at him, noting the serious expression on his face. "What is it?" "Kay, when I traded horses for you that day, it wasn't just because I felt sorry for you, or because I thought it was the right thing to do." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "Because that's what you were taught to see. What your people have always seen when they look at mine, but you looked past that, even when you had every reason to be afraid, every reason to hate." Chaitin turned to face her fully. "That kind of seeing is rare, Abby. It's precious, and it made me want to be worthy of it." Abby felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire between them. "Chaitin, I need you to know," he continued, "that whatever happens tomorrow, whatever Dalton threatens or promises or demands, my commitment to protecting you isn't based on duty or obligation anymore. It's based on caring about someone who has become important to me." The words hung in the cold air between them like visible breath, and Abby realized that something fundamental had changed in their relationship without her quite noticing. When or how? Somewhere between Cherokee lessons and trap-checking expeditions, between shared meals and comfortable silences, they had moved from captive and protector to something much more complex and much more precious. "You've become important to me too," she said quietly. "More important than I ever expected anyone to become again." Chaitin reached over and took her hand, his fingers warm despite the winter cold. "Then we'll face whatever comes next together." As Abby looked into his eyes, she realized that for the first time since her capture, she wasn't just surviving from one day to the next. She was actively choosing the kind of person she wanted to be and the kind of life she wanted to build. And tomorrow, when Dalton arrived with his threats and his greed and his assumption that she was still the same helpless victim he had left here months ago, he was going to discover just how wrong he was about what Abigail Hayes had become. Dawn broke grey and bitter over the Cherokee camp, the kind of morning that felt like the world holding its breath before something terrible happened. Abby had barely slept, her mind cycling through every possible scenario for the confrontation that now seemed inevitable, each imagined outcome more frightening than the last. The scouts had returned before first light with confirmation of what everyone already suspected. Dalton and at least 12 men were camped less than 5 miles away. their fires visible through the morning mist that clung to the valley floor like smoke from a funeral pyre. They would arrive within hours, and when they did, everything that Abby had built during her months among the Cherokee would be put to the ultimate test. She dressed carefully in the traditional Cherokee clothing that Ayanna had made for her, not because she was trying to disguise her identity, but because these garments had become her true skin, the outward expression of who she had chosen to become. The soft deerskin felt like armor against what was coming, a reminder that she was no longer the terrified settler girl who had been dragged into this camp 6 months ago. Chayton appeared at her side as she emerged from Ayanna's lodge, his own appearance transformed by war paint and weapons in ways that should have been frightening, but somehow weren't. The geometric patterns traced across his cheekbones spoke of spiritual preparation, as much as physical readiness, and the way he carried himself radiated a controlled power that had nothing to do with brutality and everything to do with absolute certainty about his purpose. "Remember," he said quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority she had learned to trust completely. "Dalton will try to make you react emotionally. He'll use fear, anger, guilt, anything that might make you forget who you are now and remember who you used to be." Abby nodded, though her heart was hammering so hard she could barely hear her own thoughts. "What if I can't do this? What if I freeze up or say the wrong thing, or then we'll handle it?" Chayton interrupted, his hand coming to rest briefly on her shoulder. "But you won't freeze up, Abby. You've been preparing for this moment your entire life, even when you didn't know it." Chief Adahi had positioned his warriors with the tactical precision of someone who had survived many such confrontations, creating multiple layers of defense that could escalate or de-escalate depending on how Dalton chose to play the situation. The message was clear without being explicitly threatening. The Cherokee were prepared for whatever came next, but they weren't looking for a fight if one could be avoided. Abby took her position at the center of the camp's main clearing, close enough to the lodges to retreat quickly if necessary, but visible enough to make it clear that she wasn't hiding. The symbolism was intentional. She was exactly where Dalton expected to find her, but she was there on her own terms, rather than as a helpless victim waiting to be reclaimed. The sound of approaching horses carried clearly through the crisp morning air, and Abby felt her mouth go dry as she recognized the particular rhythm of Dalton's distinctive laugh echoing across the distance. He was coming in confident and loud, which probably meant he expected this to be easy. That assumption was about to cost him dearly. Dalton rode into the camp at the head of a dozen hard-looking men who carried themselves like professional killers rather than simple traders. They had come prepared for violence, but they had also come expecting to find the same defenseless Cherokee community they had encountered months earlier. The surprise on Dalton's face when he saw the tactical positioning of the warriors was almost comical. "Well, well," he called out, his voice carrying the false joviality that Abby remembered from her nightmares. "Look what we have here. It seems like our little Cherokee friends have been preparing for company." Chief Adahi stepped forward, his dignity and composure making Dalton's theatrical swagger look crude by comparison. "Marcus Dalton, you were told never to return to Cherokee, our territory, yet here you are." "Here I am indeed," Dalton replied, dismounting with deliberate slowness. "And I've brought some friends along to help me collect what's mine." His eyes found Abby across the clearing, and she saw the moment when he registered how much she had changed. Gone was the terrified, broken girl he had left here as payment for horses. In her place stood someone who met his gaze steadily, someone who belonged in this place and among these people, in ways that clearly hadn't occurred to him as a possibility. "Abigail," he said, his tone shifting to the false concern she remembered from their first encounter. "My dear girl, you look different. I hope these savages haven't been mistreating you." The casual racism in his words was clearly intended to provoke A reaction from the Cherokee warriors, but Chief Adahi had prepared them well for exactly this kind of manipulation. No one moved, no one spoke, no one gave Dalton the excuse for violence he was obviously seeking. "They've been treating me exactly as I deserve to be treated," Abby replied, her voice carrying across the clearing with a clarity that surprised even her, as a human being with dignity and worth. Dalton's expression shifted, confusion flickering across his features as he processed her response. Now, don't go getting ideas above your station. You're still the same little settler girl I brought here, and I've come to take you back where you belong." "I am exactly where I belong," Abby said, taking a step forward, "and I'm not going anywhere with you." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The laughter that came from Dalton's throat was harsh and ugly, the sound of a man who had never been refused by someone he considered his property. "Oh, my dear, sweet, simple girl, you don't get to choose. You never got to choose. You're coming with me because that's what I've decided. And what I decide is what happens." "Actually," Abby replied, her voice gaining strength with each word, "I have several things to tell you about what I've decided, and what's going to happen next depends entirely on how well you listen." Something in her tone must have penetrated Dalton's arrogant assumptions, because his hand dropped to the pistol at his hip, a gesture that immediately caused every Cherokee warrior in sight to shift position in ways that suggested overwhelming firepower was now aimed in his direction. "Careful, Marcus," Chief Adahi said quietly. "You're outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and surrounded by people who would consider it a public service to eliminate you. I suggest you hear what the young woman has to say before making any decisions you'll regret." Dalton looked around, clearly recognizing for the first time that he had walked into a carefully orchestrated tactical situation rather than the easy victory he had expected. But instead of showing wisdom, his expression hardened with the stubborn pride of a man who would rather die than admit he had miscalculated. "Fine," he snarled. "Let's hear what the little savage lover has to say for herself." Abby felt Chaitan's presence behind her like a warm hand on her back, giving her the courage to speak truths that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago. "I know things about your operation that I didn't know when you first captured me," she began, her voice carrying clearly to everyone present. "I know about your routes between Fort Bridger and the Mexican territories. I know about your partner. I know about Colonel Morrison at Fort Collins," Abby continued relentlessly, "the one who pays you extra for information about Indian movements. I know about the warehouse in Santa Fe where you store merchandise until buyers can be found. I know about the account you maintain under the name William Cross at the Territorial Bank in Denver." "Shut up," Dalton hissed, his hand tightening on his weapon. "You shut your mouth right now. I know all of this," Abby pressed on, "because I listened to everything you and your men discussed during the journey here. I memorized names, dates, locations, amounts, and I've spent the last 6 months writing it all down, creating a complete record of your criminal activities." The lie came so smoothly that Abby almost believed it herself. She had indeed overheard fragments of such conversations, but nothing as comprehensive as she was claiming. But Dalton's guilty reaction told her that she had struck close enough to the truth to make her bluff effective. "Where?" he demanded. "Where is this supposed record?" "Safe," Abby replied, "and scheduled to be delivered to federal authorities if anything happens to me or to the people who have given me protection. You see, Marcus, you made a critical error. When you sold me to these Cherokee, you assumed they were like you, people who would see me as property to be used and discarded. Instead, you gave me to people who value loyalty and who understand that protecting me means protecting themselves." Dalton looked around at the Cherokee warriors surrounding him, finally beginning to understand the true nature of his situation. He had come expecting to reclaim a helpless victim, but instead he had found someone who had been transformed into a strategic threat. "You're lying," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "You're just a frightened girl trying to sound braver than you are." "Then test me," Abby challenged, taking another step forward. "Try to take me by force and see what happens. See how quickly word reaches the territorial authorities about your operation. See how long you last once Colonel Morrison discovers that his name is connected to illegal activities in written testimony from a credible witness." The standoff stretched across several tense minutes, with Dalton clearly weighing his options, while his men grew increasingly nervous about the tactical disadvantage they found themselves in. Finally, one of his lieutenants leaned over to whisper urgently in his ear, and Abby caught enough of the words to understand that even his own people were advising retreat. "This isn't over," Dalton said finally, but his words carried more desperation than threat. "You can't stay hidden among these savages forever. Eventually you'll have to return to civilization, and when you do—" "When I do," Abby interrupted, "it will be as someone who has powerful friends and detailed knowledge of your criminal activities. Someone who can cause you far more trouble than profit. Someone who is worth much more to you alive and happy than dead or captive." Chief Adahi stepped forward, his presence adding official weight to Abby's words. "Marcus Dalton, you have violated Cherokee territory for the last time. You will leave immediately and you will not return. Any attempt to harm this woman or any member of this community will result in consequences that extend far beyond what you can imagine. And if we refuse?" Dalton asked, though his heart clearly wasn't in the challenge anymore. "Then you will discover exactly why smart people don't threaten Cherokee hospitality," Chayton said, speaking for the first time since the confrontation began. His voice carried a quiet certainty that was somehow more menacing than any amount of bluster could have been. Dalton looked from Chayton to Chief Adahi to the warriors positioned throughout the camp, clearly recognizing that he was completely outmatched. But it was when his gaze returned to Abby that she saw the exact moment when he understood that his power over her was permanently broken. She was no longer afraid of him, not because she was being protected by others, but because she had become someone who didn't need to fear men like him, someone who had found her own strength and learned to use it effectively. "You've changed," he said, and for the first time his voice held genuine surprise rather than calculated menace. "Yes," Abby agreed simply. "I have—" Dalton remounted, his horse, his movements sharp with frustrated anger. "Don't think this makes you safe forever. Don't think—" "Marcus," Abby interrupted, her tone almost gentle now. "I don't think about you at all anymore. You're not important enough to occupy space in my thoughts. You're just a problem that's been solved." The dismissal hit him harder than any threat could have, and Abby watched as Marcus Dalton rode out of the Cherokee camp for the final time, his shoulders slumped with the defeat of a man who had discovered that his weapons were useless against someone who refused to be intimidated by them. As the sound of retreating horses faded into the distance, Abby felt something inside her chest that had been clenched tight for months finally begin to relax. The confrontation was over, and she had not only survived it, she had won it on her own terms and through her own strength. Chayton appeared at her side, his war paint somehow making his smile even more brilliant than usual. "That was impressive," he said quietly. "That was terrifying," Abby replied honestly, "but also liberating." Chief Adahi approached them both, his weathered face showing approval that felt more valuable than any praise she had ever received. "You have proven today that courage can be more powerful than weapons, and that wisdom can be more effective than violence." "I had good teachers," Abby said, looking around at the Cherokee community that had given her not just shelter, but the opportunity to discover who she truly was when she wasn't defined by other people's expectations or limitations. And now, the chief continued, you must decide what comes next. Dalton will not return, but that doesn't resolve the question of your future. Winter is ending, travel will become possible again, and you must choose what kind of life you want to build. As Abby looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had become family in ways that went far deeper than blood relationship, she realized that she had already made her choice. She had been sold into this community as property, but she would remain in it as family, by her own free will and on her own terms. Spring arrived in the Cherokee Mountains like a whispered promise finally kept, transforming the stark winter landscape into something that seemed almost too beautiful to be real. Ice melted into streams that sang with renewed life. Bare branches exploded into clouds of green that made the air itself seem to pulse with possibility. And everywhere Abby looked, the world was waking up from its long sleep. She stood at the edge of the bluff that overlooked the valley where Dalton had made his camp 2 months earlier, watching the morning mist rise from ground that no longer held any terror for her. The confrontation that had seemed so momentous at the time now felt like something from another lifetime, a story about someone else's fears rather than her own lived experience. Regrets? Chayton asked, appearing beside her with the quiet grace she had learned to associate with his presence, about facing down Dalton. Never. Abby turned to look at him, noting how the spring light caught the copper highlights in his dark hair. But about other things. Maybe they had been having this conversation in various forms for weeks now, ever since the snows had melted enough to make travel possible again. Chief Adahi had made it clear that she was welcome to remain with the Cherokee permanently, but he had also arranged for safe passage to any settlement she might choose if she decided to return to white society. The choice was entirely hers, with no pressure from anyone about what she should decide, which somehow made the decision infinitely more difficult than if someone had simply told her what to do. "Tell me about the regrets," Chayton said, settling down on a sun-warmed boulder that provided a perfect view of the valley below. Abby joined him, close enough that their shoulders touched, a casual intimacy that had developed so gradually she couldn't remember when it had begun to feel natural. "I keep thinking about my father's grave back near Cheyenne. I haven't visited it since everything happened. It feels wrong to abandon that connection completely." "And you think staying here means abandoning it? Doesn't it?" Abby picked up a small stone and turned it over in her hands, studying its smooth surface as if it might hold answers to questions she wasn't sure how to ask. Chayton was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something in the distance that might have been hawks circling over the far ridge. When he finally spoke, his words carried the careful consideration she had learned to value above almost. "Anything else? My grandfather used to say that a river doesn't abandon the mountains when it flows toward the sea. It carries the minerals and memories of its source with it, making the ocean richer for having received them. The river becomes something new without forgetting what it was." "That's a beautiful thought," Abby said softly. "But rivers don't have to make conscious choices about which direction to flow, don't they?" Chayton turned to look at her directly, his dark eyes serious. "Every bend, every confluence, every decision about which path to take around an obstacle, rivers choose their course, moment by moment, just like people do." The metaphor was compelling, but Abby found herself struggling with questions that went beyond philosophy into the practical realities of building a life. "What about children, Chayton? If I... She stumbled over the words, suddenly feeling heat rise in her cheeks. "If we marry," he said quietly, supplying the words she couldn't quite bring herself to speak. "If we build a family together, you're worried about what kind of world we would be creating for them. The world is changing so fast," Abby said, grateful that he understood what she was trying to express. The removal policies, the territorial expansion, the conflicts between settlers and tribes. Where would children with Cherokee fathers and white mothers fit in any of that? Chayton reached over and took the stone from her hands, holding it up to catch the morning light. "Look at this," he said. "What do you see?" "Want a rock?" Abby replied, confused by the apparent change of subject. "I see granite from the high peaks, worn smooth by water that carried it down from the mountains. I see quartz veins that formed deep underground, brought to the surface by forces beyond anyone's control. I see a dozen different minerals that came together to create something that's stronger than any of its individual components." Abby began to understand where he was leading the conversation. "You're saying that children who carry both heritages might be stronger because of that complexity, not weaker. I'm saying that strength comes from integration, not purity. That the most beautiful things in nature are usually the result of different elements combining in unexpected ways." Chayton handed the stone back to her. "And I'm saying that any children we might have would inherit the best of both worlds. Your intelligence and determination, your people's knowledge of commerce and technology, combined with Cherokee understanding of community and connection, and to the natural world." The possibility he was describing was so appealing that it made Abby's chest ache with longing. She had spent so many months feeling caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, that the idea of creating something new that honored both traditions felt like finding water in a desert. But what about the practical problems? She asked, forcing herself to consider the obstacles rather than just the dreams. Where would we live? How would we support a family? What happens when territorial policies make it impossible for Cherokee communities to remain in their traditional lands? "Those are real concerns," Chayton acknowledged, "but they're not insurmountable. Some Cherokee families are already adapting by establishing homesteads that look like settler farms to government officials, but maintain traditional practices and values within the family structure. Others are finding ways to blend into frontier communities while preserving their cultural identity." "You're talking about hiding," Abby said. "I'm talking about surviving," Chayton corrected. "About being smart enough to protect what matters most while adapting to circumstances we can't control. That's not cowardice, Abby. It's strategic thinking." As they talked, other members of the community had begun their daily activities around the camp below them. Abby could see Ayana working with several other women on what looked like preparations for a ceremony of some kind. Children playing games that involved elaborate rules she was still learning. Men engaged in the kind of serious discussions that suggested important decisions were being made. "There's something else I need to tell you," Chayton said, his tone shifting to something more formal. "The council has been discussing the future of this particular community, and some decisions have been made that might affect your thinking about staying." Abby felt her stomach tighten with sudden anxiety. "What kind of decisions?" "We're going to move," Chayton said simply. "Not immediately, but before the next winter. The pressure from territorial authorities is increasing, and Chief Adahi believes it's only a matter of time before we're forced to relocate anyway. Better to choose our own destination and timing than to wait until we have no choices left." "Where?" Abby asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to hear the answer. "West, toward the Pacific Territories. There are valleys in what the whites call Oregon, where Cherokee communities have already established themselves, places where the government presence is still minimal and the local populations are more concerned with their own survival than with enforcing federal policies about tribal removal. The prospect of another major disruption, another journey into unknown territory, felt overwhelming to Abby after everything she had already endured. But as she thought about it, she realized that her reaction wasn't based on fear of the unknown. It was based on fear of losing what she had found. "Would you want me to come with you?" she asked quietly. If you and I were married, Would I be welcome in this new place? Chaitan's answer came without hesitation. You would be more than welcome. You would be essential. Abby, you have skills and knowledge that could help our people establish successful relationships with white communities in Oregon. Your understanding of both cultures could make the difference between integration and isolation. You're asking me to be a bridge, Abby realized. I'm asking you to be yourself, Chaitan replied. Someone who belongs fully to both worlds and therefore can help others navigate between them. The conversation was interrupted by a call from below. Ayana was gesturing for them to return to camp, apparently needed for whatever preparations were underway. As they made their way down the rocky slope, Abby found herself paying attention to details she had stopped noticing during her months of familiarity with Cherokee daily life. The way people moved with consideration for others, never rushing or pushing, but somehow managing to accomplish complex tasks with remarkable efficiency. The way children were included in adult activities as contributors rather than obstacles, learning responsibility through participation rather than instruction. The way decisions were made through discussion and consensus rather than authority and coercion. What's happening? Abby asked as they approached the group of women working around what appeared to be a ceremonial fire. Spring ceremony, Ayana replied, looking up from the complex pattern of colored corn she was arranging. On a woven mat, celebration of renewal, of new growth, of choices that lead to new life. The timing felt significant in ways that Abby suspected were not coincidental. Cherokee ceremonies, she had learned, often served multiple purposes: spiritual, social, and practical guidance for community decisions. The fact that a renewal ceremony was happening just as she was wrestling with questions about her own future seemed like the kind of meaningful coincidence that Cherokee philosophy would interpret as guidance from spiritual sources. "Am I allowed to participate?" she asked. "You are allowed to do whatever feels authentic to your heart," Ayana replied. "But participation in this ceremony traditionally marks a commitment to the community and its future. It is not something to undertake lightly." As the day progressed, Abby found herself drawn into the elaborate preparations for the evening ceremony. There was something deeply satisfying about working alongside women who had welcomed her not as an outsider to be tolerated, but as a sister to be cherished, contributing her efforts to something that would benefit the entire community. But it was during the afternoon, as she helped prepare special foods that would be shared during the ceremony, that she had the conversation that finally clarified her thinking about the choice she faced. "You have been quiet today," observed Sequoia, an older woman whose granddaughter was close to Abby's age. "Thinking deep thoughts about your future." "Trying to," Abby admitted. "But I keep getting caught between what I think I should want and what I actually do want." Sequoia smiled, her weathered hands continuing to work as she talked. "Tell me about these different wants. I think I should want to return to white society, to find some way to rebuild the life that was taken from me, to honor my father's memory by living the kind of life he would have expected me to live." "And what do you actually want?" Abby was quiet for a long moment, surprised by how difficult the question was to answer honestly. "I want because choosing what I want feels like betraying what I should want, like I'm abandoning my responsibilities to my father's memory and my own heritage." Sequoia stopped working and turned to look at Abby directly. "Child, do you think your father would want you to be miserable in order to honor his memory? Do you think he would want you to reject love and family and belonging because those gifts came from people he had been taught to fear?" I don't know," Abby admitted. He never had the chance to know Cherokee people the way I do. He might have felt differently if he had. Then perhaps the best way to honor his memory is to live a life that proves his daughter learned to. See past the prejudices that limited his vision, Sequoia suggested. Perhaps the greatest tribute you could pay him is to become someone who builds bridges where he saw only walls. That evening, as the spring ceremony unfolded under stars that seemed particularly bright in the clear mountain air, Abby made her choice, not through dramatic announcement or formal declaration, but through the simple act of full participation in the ritual that welcomed new growth and celebrated the community's commitment to renewal. When the time came for individuals to speak their intentions for the coming year, she stood and addressed the gathering in Cherokee, her words carrying clearly through the warm night air. I choose to remain with this people, not as a guest or an outsider seeking protection, but as a daughter and sister who has found her true family. I choose to contribute my skills and knowledge to our collective future, to help build bridges between Cherokee wisdom and the changing world around us. I choose to move west with this community and to help create new ways of being Cherokee that honor our traditions while adapting to new circumstances. When she sat down, the silence that followed was broken by the sound of approval from dozens of voices, but it was Chaitin's hand finding hers in the darkness that told her she had made the right decision. Later, as the ceremony wound down and people began to drift back to their lodges, Chaitin walked with her to the edge of the camp where they could talk privately. "No regrets?" he asked, echoing their conversation from the morning. "None," Abby replied, and realized with some surprise that it was completely true. "For the first time since my father died, I feel like I'm moving towards something I want, rather than just away from something I fear." Chaitin stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious in the moonlight. "Abby, will you marry me? Not because circumstances have thrown us together, not because it's convenient or practical, but because I love who you are and who you're becoming." The proposal was so direct and honest that it took her breath away. "Yes," she said, the word coming out as barely more than a whisper. "Yes, I'll marry you, because I love you too, and because I can't imagine building a future with anyone else." As Chaitin pulled her into his arms, Abby realized that she had finally found what she had been searching for without even knowing she was searching. Not just safety or belonging, but the chance to become the person she was meant to be. Someone who honored her past while embracing her future. Someone who built bridges instead of walls. Someone who chose love over fear at every opportunity. The girl who had been dragged into this Cherokee camp as a terrified captive was gone, replaced by a woman who had chosen to stay as a beloved daughter. And in that choosing, Abigail Hayes had finally found her way home. 5 years had passed since Abby Hayes became Abby Chaitin, and the Oregon Territory stretched before their small Cherokee community like a promise finally fulfilled. The valley they had chosen for their new home lay cradled between forested hills that reminded everyone of the mountains they had left behind, while offering something that had become increasingly precious: isolation from the territorial policies that continued to tear apart tribal communities throughout the eastern regions. The settlement they had built bore little resemblance to the temporary camps of their traveling years, or even to the traditional Cherokee communities of their ancestral lands. Instead, it represented something entirely new, a deliberate fusion of Cherokee wisdom and frontier practicality that had allowed them to thrive in ways that pure traditionalism or complete assimilation never could have achieved. Abby stood in the doorway of the cabin she shared with Chaitin and their 2 young children, watching the morning routine of a community that had learned to balance survival with identity in ways that would have seemed impossible during those first terrifying days of her captivity, Cherokee voices mixed with English as families prepared for their daily tasks. Children who were growing up bilingual and bicultural moved between traditional games and frontier skills with equal comfort, and adults navigated complex relationships with white neighbors through a combination of diplomacy, strategic transparency, and carefully maintained boundaries. "Mama, Papa says the traders are coming today," announced 4-year-old Sarah, bursting through the door with the unlimited energy that seemed to define her existence. Born during the harsh winter they had spent in Colorado, during their westward journey, she had inherited her mother's green eyes and her father's unshakable confidence in her place in the world. "I know, little bird," Abby replied, smoothing her daughter's dark hair that never seemed to stay properly braided despite daily attention. "And you remember what we discussed about how to behave when outsiders visit our community? Be polite, but not too friendly. Speak English unless someone asks about Cherokee words, and never answer questions about how many people live here, or what we trade with other settlements," Sarah recited with the precision of a child who had heard these instructions many times before. The necessity of such coaching spoke to the delicate balance that frontier Cherokee communities had to maintain, visible enough to avoid seeming secretive or threatening, but private enough to protect themselves from the kind of detailed scrutiny that could attract unwanted government attention. It was a constant negotiation that required everyone, including the children, to understand their roles in maintaining the community's safety. Chayton appeared in the doorway carrying 2-year-old Samuel, whose solemn expression and tendency toward careful observation had already earned him the Cherokee name Watching Bear from his grandfather. The boy had his father's dark eyes and his mother's stubborn chin, along with what appeared to be an inherited gift for understanding people's motivations that made him unnervingly perceptive for someone barely old enough to speak in complete sentences. "The Morrison family is with them this time," Chayton reported, settling Samuel on his hip while reaching for the coffee that had become one of their few concessions to purely American customs. "James Morrison specifically asked to meet with you." Abby felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that accompanied any interaction with white settlers who knew enough about her background to have specific requests. The Morrison family had established a successful farm about 20 miles east of the Cherokee settlement, and over the past 2 years they had developed a cautiously friendly relationship that benefited both communities through trade and shared resources. But James Morrison was also the nephew of Colonel Morrison from Fort Collins, the same officer whose name Abby had used to threaten Dalton during their confrontation years earlier. She had never been entirely certain whether the connection was coincidental or whether the younger Morrison had sought out their community specifically because of stories his uncle might have told about Cherokee involvement in disrupting illegal trading operations. "Did he say what he wanted to discuss?" Abby asked, though she suspected she already knew. "He mentioned something about territorial representatives coming through the region next month, asking questions about tribal settlements and their compliance with federal policies." Chayton replied carefully, "He thinks we should be prepared for official scrutiny." The warning was both generous and troubling. Generous because Morrison was clearly trying to protect neighbors he had grown to respect. Troubling because it confirmed what many in the community had feared, that their period of peaceful isolation was probably coming to an end. "How much does he know about our actual situation?" Abby asked. "Enough to understand that we're not exactly the simple farming community we appear to be from a distance," Chayton said. "But not enough to pose a threat if his intentions remain friendly." Over the years, Abby had become expert at reading the subtle distinctions that determined whether white neighbors represented opportunities or dangers. Morrison fell into the category of people who were genuinely trying to be helpful while also protecting their own interests. A complicated But James Morrison arrived that afternoon with a small group of traders and his own family, including a wife and teenage daughter who had visited the Cherokee settlement several times and developed genuine friendships with some of the community members. The familiarity was reassuring. People who had invested in personal relationships were less likely to create problems that would jeopardize those connections. "Mrs. Chayton," Morrison began, using the name by which she was known to white neighbors, "I appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. I know these conversations can be delicate, given the political climate." "Please, call me Abby," she replied, gesturing for everyone to sit around the large table that dominated the center of the hall. "And you're right that the political climate makes these discussions complicated. But that's exactly why they're necessary." Morrison nodded, his weathered face showing the kind of concern that spoke to genuine friendship rather than mere diplomatic courtesy. "I won't pretend to understand all the details of federal policies toward tribal communities, but I know enough to recognize that things are getting more restrictive rather than less so. The territorial representatives who are coming next month aren't just conducting routine surveys. They're specifically looking for Cherokee settlements that might be operating outside official oversight." The information was valuable, but not particularly surprising. Similar pressures had been building throughout the Western Territories as federal authorities tried to implement the same removal and concentration policies that had proven so devastating in the eastern states. "What kind of oversight are they expecting to find?" Abby asked. "Registration with territorial authorities, compliance with approved settlement patterns, demonstration of successful integration with local white communities," Morrison replied, reading from notes he had clearly prepared for this conversation. "Communities that can't demonstrate all three elements are subject to forced relocation to designated tribal lands." Abby exchanged glances with Chayton and the other Cherokee leaders who had gathered for the meeting. Their community was probably vulnerable on all three requirements. They had deliberately avoided formal registration to maintain their autonomy. Their settlement pattern was based on Cherokee rather than American principles, and while they had successful relationships with neighbors like the Morrisons, they had also maintained enough cultural distinctiveness to be clearly identifiable as a tribal community rather than an assimilated group of individuals. "How much time do we have?" Chief Adahi asked, his voice carrying the calm authority that had guided the community through every previous crisis. 6 weeks, maybe 8, Morrison replied. "But Abby, there might be another option that's worth considering." "I'm listening," she said, though something in his tone made her wary. "My uncle has considerable influence with territorial authorities, and he's spoken very highly of your role in disrupting illegal trading operations several years ago. If you were willing to serve as an official liaison between your community and the territorial government, it might provide the kind of legitimacy that would satisfy the oversight requirements." The offer hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire, and Abby could feel the weight of everyone's attention as they waited for her response. It was a generous proposal that could solve their immediate problems, but it was also a fundamental change in the community's relationship with American authority. "What would that involve exactly?" she asked carefully. "Regular reports on community activities, assistance with any territorial investigations that might affect Cherokee interests, and basically serving as a bridge between your people's needs and the government's requirements," Morrison explained. "It would formalize the role you've already been playing informally, but with official protection and recognition." Abby felt the familiar sensation of standing at a crossroads where every choice carried profound consequences. Accepting Morrison's proposal would provide security for the community, but would also make her personally responsible for maintaining relationships with authorities who might eventually demand compromises she couldn't accept. Refusing it would preserve their autonomy, but might leave them vulnerable to forced removal or worse. "I need to discuss this with my husband and the community council," she said finally. "This isn't a decision I can make alone." "Of course," Morrison agreed. "But don't take too long. The opportunity might not remain available indefinitely." That evening, as the Cherokee community gathered for its weekly council meeting, Abby found herself at the center of a debate that touched on fundamental questions about identity, survival, and the price of adaptation. Some members argued that accepting official oversight was simply recognizing a reality they couldn't avoid, that maintaining complete autonomy was becoming impossible, and strategic cooperation was their best hope for preserving what mattered. Most others insisted that formal integration with territorial authority would inevitably lead to the destruction of Cherokee identity, that once they accepted American definitions of legitimacy, they would lose the ability to resist American demands for assimilation. "What do you think, Abby?" Chief Addy asked, after hours of discussion had failed to produce consensus. "You understand both worlds better than anyone here. What does your heart tell you about this choice?" Abby looked around at the faces surrounding her, people who had become family through shared experience rather than blood relation. People who had trusted her judgment in previous crises. People whose futures would be shaped by whatever decision emerged from this conversation. "I think," she said slowly, "that we're being forced to choose between two different kinds of survival. Physical survival that might come at the cost of cultural death, or cultural preservation that might lead to physical destruction." "And which do you choose?" asked one of the younger men, who had been most vocal in opposing any accommodation. "With territorial authorities, I choose to reject the premise of the question," Abby replied, her voice gaining strength as she worked through her thoughts. "I think we're being told that we have only two options because someone wants us to believe that. But throughout our history, Cherokee people have found third options that preserved both survival and identity." "What kind of third option?" Chayton asked, though his tone suggested he might already be following her reasoning. "We become exactly what James Morrison suggested, a bridge between Cherokee needs and American requirements. But we do it on our own terms, maintaining enough official cooperation to avoid forced removal while preserving enough autonomy to continue being Cherokee." "And how do we ensure that this cooperation doesn't eventually consume our independence?" Chief Adahi asked. Abby smiled, remembering something Chayton had taught her years earlier about rivers choosing their own courses. "We make sure that we're always flowing toward our own destinations, even when we have to navigate around obstacles we can't remove." The discussion continued well into the night, but gradually a plan emerged that reflected the community's collective wisdom about adaptation and resistance. Abby would accept the liaison position, but with carefully defined limits on what she would report and how she would represent Cherokee interests. The community would register with territorial authorities, but under a structure that preserved Cherokee governance while satisfying American requirements for recognized leadership. They would demonstrate integration with local white communities, but through partnerships that benefited both groups rather than assimilation that erased Cherokee identity. 3 months later, as Abby prepared her first official report for territorial authorities, she reflected on how much had changed since that terrified 17-year-old girl had been dragged into a Cherokee camp as unwilling property. The woman writing this report was someone who had learned to navigate between worlds, not by choosing one or the other, but by creating new possibilities that honored both. The report itself was a masterpiece of strategic transparency, providing enough information to satisfy bureaucratic requirements while carefully omitting details that could be used against the community's interests. It described successful agricultural production, peaceful relationships with neighboring settlers, and effective self-governance without revealing the specifically Cherokee nature of many of their practices. But more importantly, it established Abby is someone who could speak with authority about both Cherokee capabilities and American expectations, someone whose credibility with territorial authorities made her community more valuable as an ally than as a target for removal. "Any regrets?" Chayton asked that evening, as they sat on the porch of their cabin, watching their children play. Abby looked out at the community they had helped create. Houses that blended Cherokee and American architectural principles, gardens that grew both traditional and introduced crops according to Cherokee agricultural wisdom, children who moved fluidly between languages and cultures without feeling like they had to choose between them. "The only regret I have," she said finally, "is that my father never got the chance to see this. Never got the chance to understand that Cherokee people weren't his enemies, that the real enemies were men like Dalton who profited from keeping different groups afraid of each other." Chayton reached over and took her hand, his fingers intertwining, with hers in the gesture that had become their private symbol of partnership through every challenge they had faced. "Maybe that's why this matters so much," he suggested. "Maybe building bridges like this is how we honor people like your father who never got the chance to cross them." As the sun set over their valley, painting the sky in colors that seemed too beautiful for the harsh realities of territorial politics and cultural survival, Abby realized that she had finally found the answer to the question that had haunted her since childhood. She had discovered what it meant to be truly free. Not free from responsibility or connection, but free to choose who to become and how to live in alignment with her deepest values. Free to love without reservation, to contribute without resentment, to build something meaningful that would outlast her own lifetime. The terrified captive who had arrived in that Cherokee camp 8 years earlier was gone, replaced by a woman who understood that the greatest victory over people like Dalton wasn't just surviving their cruelty, but building something so beautiful and strong that their hatred became irrelevant. Abigail Chayton had found her true home not by returning to where she came from, but by choosing to become who she was, always meant to be. And in that choosing, she had discovered that freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.